I'm speaking with Arnold August, who's back on Voice with Vision. This is an interesting time to be speaking with Arnold. Arnold is the author of Cuba and Its Neighbors, Democracy in Motion, and also your latest book that we just got finished doing a book event for you, Cuba, U.S. Relations, Obama, and Beyond. And so right now, Cuba has just had elections, what they call their...
they had the municipal elections last fall. And more recently, they had the elections to the National Assembly, which took place on March 11th, 2018. And out of that, you have the new parliament that was elected of 605 deputies. And it was this parliament that yesterday and today, amongst the elected deputies, that elected the President of the Council of State, which is the head of state of Cuba, and in this case now it's Miguel Díaz-Canel, who is officially the new president of Cuba as of today.
Right, and then people are looking at it as historic because it's the first time that position, the president of the Council of State, has not been, quote unquote, as the Western media, has not been a Castro, and they kind of spin it in a way that makes it seem like it's almost like some a dynasty or something like that.
Exactly.
But I think, and that's what I think. One, we want to address this. I'd like to address it because we want to bring to people a better perspective than what the corporate or the capitalist media and press here will do. Mm-hmm. But also, I think that Cuban elections are a lesson. Not just Cuban elections, but I think elections anywhere. They're really a lesson for people, a political education lesson. And we want to unpack some of that. So here the coverage is done in a way to disparage the Cuban democratic system and its organic emergence from Cuba's unique history.
Right.
And I think you really do a good job, particularly for your first book, Cuba and Its Neighbors, Democracy in Motion, of giving people an account of how the system there's a democratic system. Some people wouldn't even know they have elections that has organically arisen out of the revolution, and also even before. You go way back before then, but we can't go all the way back then. No. So can you talk about some of that, the emergence, the organic link between Cuba's, at least the revolutionary period, and what the democratic system is now.
Now, as we watch the news, as you mentioned, from the mainstream media, they keep on mentioning the fact that, of course, Miguel Díaz-Canel was elected as president of the Council of State and president of Cuba. But you have Raúl Castro, was the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, and they put the Communist Party of Cuba sort of in contradiction to the National Assembly of People's Power. But in fact, they both exist in Cuba. Like they say there's only one party in Cuba, but as you hinted at in your initial introduction to what I'm saying now, the notion of a party, one party to lead the revolution, goes back to the mid-19th century from José Martí, who said we need one revolutionary party to lead the revolution in the 19th century. Then Fidel Castro in the 1950s managed, as only he can do, to gather the different factions, left-wing factions and different political organizations in Cuba towards the end of the 50s and early 60s in order to form one unified communist party. Now, in the Cuban Constitution, it says that the leading force in Cuban society is the Communist Party of Cuba. In the same constitution, it also says that the political power rests in the hands of the people, which is represented in the National Assembly of People's Power. So is that a contradiction? Some people seem to say it is, that you cannot have the Communist Party of Cuba having an important role to play, while you have it runs in contradiction with the National Assembly of People's Power and the Council of State being representative of the political power of the people. But we have to look at every system has its own features. The United States, of course, we have here its own type of democracy, if you want to talk in that sort of way. But Cuba has its own history and its own tradition. We have to look at it from the Cuban point of view, where there is no contradiction at all between the Communist Party of Cuba and people having sovereignty vested in their own hands. In fact, I would say in this book that you mentioned, Cuba and Its Neighbors, I give the example of the Communist Party of Cuba being in the forefront of encouraging people to take things into their own hands. For example, where everyone's aware that changes are going on in Cuba now, social and economic changes. People are aware of the changes that are going on at this point. They're decentralizing the state. There's over 600,000 people who work in the private sector and other such changes that are going on now. Now, how did this come about? It was the Communist Party of Cuba in 2007, led by Raúl Castro, who was supposed to be a dictator and all that. He said at that time, look, there's a lot of problems facing Cuba. Everyone should meet in their neighborhoods, places of work, university, educational centers, and discuss what the issues are and what people think should be done about these issues. This took place in 2007, 2008, and these discussions resulted in all the changes that are taking place now in a Congress of the Communist Party of Cuba, which worked out the guidelines to lead the updating of the social system, as it is being called in Cuba. And once these guidelines were worked out, they were then presented to the National Assembly of People's Power, who is responsible for working out the laws, the legislation to implement those principles. So you see, far from one being what the Communist Party of Cuba being in contradiction with the National Assembly of People's Power, we see they actually work together for the same common goal, and this is how things operate in Cuba.
Mm-hmm. So kind of like kind of like the organic relationship between the elite rich oligarchy and the and the Congress and the Senate. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I know what you're saying. Yeah, but it's important to take this into account. Like it seems to be, that's why I give this example in my book, that the Communist Party in Cuba, in a way, it's more advanced, has better experience in trying to get people to discuss and debate in order to change things, in order to take things into their hands, to change things. And that is the role of the Communist Party of Cuba. And I think it's interesting to note that today it was also announced that even though Raúl Castro is no longer president, he's a former president as of today, and Miguel Díaz-Canel is the president. And at the same time, Raúl Castro is still first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, and he will be first secretary until the next party congress in 2021, in about 3 years. Now, it was also announced today that once Raúl Castro retires in 2021 at the next party congress, the proposal is already on the table that Miguel Díaz-Canel would be the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba. So, of course, the mainstream media is, all upset about that. Once again, you have, one person, all the political power in the hands of one person. But this shows that for Cuba, the most important thing is unity of the people. Mm-hmm. That you have the Communist Party of Cuba, the National Assembly of People's Power, the people, the grassroots at all levels working together in order to develop their own system. Now, in Cuba, as you know, there are lots of problems in terms of the society, in terms of the political system. But I think the basic thing is it's up to the Cuban people to change things. It's up to the Cuban people to improve their own political system. And what really impressed me today, coming out of the speeches of both Raúl Castro and Miguel Díaz-Canel, is that they announced that there is going to be a reform of the Constitution. And as you know, I'm very interested in political affairs and constitution and electoral laws and all that, and the political system. This, to me, it was music to my ears and music to the ears of many Cubans, because today, in preparing for the interviews that I have today, I called some of my Cuban colleagues in Havana, and I asked them, well, what's your impression? He said, well, they said, all of them said pretty much the same thing, that the speech by Miguel Díaz-Canel today, his first speech as president, was extraordinary. It was something really special. So I asked why. And the reason that they all gave in different ways was that he said that the Cuban Revolution has to become increasingly self-critical. We have to be able to criticize ourselves for our shortcomings. We have to be increasingly able to perfect, to improve our political system, improve the social system. And this is taking place. And the fact that the new president comes to power at the same time where they're announcing the reform of the Constitution. In fact, discussion about reforming the Constitution is going to start in July, according to an announcement made in the National Assembly today. The July 2018, we're having a working commission of the parliament and of the party who are going to work out the changes that they think are necessary to bring to the Constitution. One has to keep in mind that the current Constitution was adopted in 1976. That's a long time ago. Of course, before it was adopted, a draft Constitution was presented to the people in 1974, 1975, and discussion took place throughout the country on the draft Constitution, and changes were made to that Constitution until they finally came up with the final draft, the final Constitution, which was then presented to the people in a referendum. And 97% of the people voted in that referendum, and 97% of the people that voted in favor of that Constitution. Yesterday I was speaking at Alfred University, a professor, sort of, I guess you could call him a right-wing professor. He sort of chided me by saying, well, 97%, that sounds like something would happen with Putin and Russia and things like that. But he missed the point that the 97% that voted in 1976, that was after 2 years of discussion and input by the people in order to come up with a Constitution that reflects the sentiment of the people. Now, the fact that the Cubans are getting into high gear in the next few months to work out a draft constitution with changes and reform, this is very significant. It means that there's going to be, once again, a major debate in Cuba, major debates and discussion at Cuba at the grassroots level, at the places of work, in the neighborhoods, at the educational institutes. And this is actually taking place now. I just came back from Cuba. Once again, I always keep on repeating the same thing. Contrary to what is said, in Cuba, if you want to find a place that there's a lot of debate on discussion and how to improve their political system and how to improve their economic and social system, it's in Cuba. Everyone is discussing it at this time. And the reform of the Constitution is going to be a continuation of the spontaneous discussion that is going on in Cuba at the time and how to improve their system. I think the most important thing is there are problems, but it's up to the Cuban people to discuss it, and it is not at all well known outside of Cuba. The amount of debate and discussion that takes place within the realm of the Cuban Revolution. That is, people have different views on how to improve it. But, for example, when it comes to the political system, they want to improve it, but they do not want to have a multi-party system as we have in the United States and Canada or the West. When they want to improve the economy, they do not want to have a market economy based on capitalism as we have in the United States and Canada. They want to have a socialist system that is decentralized, at the same time as capable of giving a proper all the necessities in life. And there's also important issues such, for example, the need to improve the salaries in Cuba. So this is a very complicated thing, but I think the reform of the Constitution is going to rejuvenate the entire revolution in Cuba. After 60 years, it's interesting to note after that January 1st, 1919 is the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. Just say that's really something. Standing up to U.S. imperialism for all this time, for 60 years. And I think that the anniversary of this revolution in 2019, Cuba is going to go through a second revolution in terms of debate and discussion how to improve their system. Very interesting times, I believe.
Right. It sounds like it, and from what you're saying, also, Cubans always refer to the revolution as a process and not like this isolated incident. It's an ongoing thing.
Exactly.
Now, if we can go into some, because some of the stuff you raise, and we've talked about this before, but it doesn't hurt to remind people to kind of reiterate, and some people may not have more of the details of the system, some of the things. So before the Council of State, the president of the Council of State has been a Castro, Fidel Castro, and then Raul.
Right.
And people don't know. I mean, they assumed that this was a dictatorship because the people are still in, and they don't know about elections. And it happened to be that the Constitution allows for the unlimited term limits. From my understanding, now there's debate talking about. You just said that they're talking about term limits now.
Yeah, in fact, Raul Castro himself made the proposal several years ago to change the system in Cuba so the main leadership would be limited to 2 mandates, that is 10 years, 2 5-year mandates, and he is putting into practice what he suggested. For example, today, he is no longer presenting himself to be president of the Council of State. He's done his two mandates. And one would guess that Miguel Díaz-Canel, if he continues for 2 more mandates, in 10 years, he will no longer be able to present himself to be president. So all these new type of experiences are taking place in Cuba. And Cuba that's one of the things that fascinates me, and I think you have the same feeling, is that Cuba is a place that changes take place there. It's always rejuvenating itself. Mm-hmm. And what I like about the elections today, I mean, of course, Fidel Castro and Raul Castro, they're in a league on their own. But at the same time, Miguel Díaz-Canel represents a breath of fresh air. Not that there was something stale in Fidel or Raul, but a breath of fresh air. And it's normal that a new generation starts to have its place in the Cuban Revolution. And Miguel Díaz-Canel, I believe, represents that. Tomorrow he's going to be 59 years old. That's pretty young. Mm-hmm. At the same time, he has accumulated quite a lot of experience over the years.
Mm-hmm. And I heard you mention in another interview that I happened to hear you talking to someone about him formerly being a minister of the higher education and some other backgrounds.
Yeah, I would say I had this great experience. Miguel Díaz-Canel was Minister of Higher Education, that is responsible for all of the universities across Cuba. And there are a lot of universities across Cuba and a lot of students in the universities across Cuba because, unlike here, education is free. Everyone attends university there.
Huge job.
It's a huge job. Now, he, people are talking about, what did he do, what did he accomplish, what he's all about. I have my own way of gauging it. I was invited to a university congress in last March in Havana, and I spent 4 days there with the professors, the vice ministries, etc., talking about everything in Cuba, and including speaking in classes at universities in Havana. And I found, much to my surprise, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I have to admit I was surprised, the Ministry of Education, the ministers, vice ministers, the university students, it's a real hotbed of revolution, So I think that Miguel Díaz-Canel left his imprint on the Ministry of Higher Education, and he is part of this new movement of young people who want to further and deepen the revolution.
Can we give people maybe a summary of the electoral process in terms of how people, are elected to the various levels, the representatives of various levels, municipal, provincial, and national?
Yes.
And then also you referred to some reforms. I've heard that people also talking about, previously the Council of State was elected by the Minister of the National Assembly.
It still is now.
Right. And so I've heard, that, and I don't know if this is true, you can clarify it or not, that there have been moves or desires for that position to move to being directly elected by the people. So maybe going through the process and if there's any legitimacy to it.
Just like, for example, how did we get to the situation today and yesterday where the deputies elected Miguel Díaz-Canel to be president of the Council of State? The Cuban elections began in the fall of last year, 2017, for elections to the municipal assembly. It's a very complicated process in which people at the local level, from amongst their own neighbors, they nominate people to run as candidates to be delegates to the municipal assembly, and the voting takes place in a secret ballot vote as who should be elected to the municipal assembly. Once the municipal assemblies are established, then you have the second phase takes place. That is, election to, for example, the National Assembly. Now, what is of interest in Cuba, and there's no other country in the world like it, that by law, up to half of the deputies to be elected to the National Assembly must be delegates who had been elected to municipal assembly. So then elections take place for the deputies to the National Assembly. And how does that take place? People are made aware of the candidates to be elected. Their names and biographies are put in public places such as market markets, local markets, grocery stores, high schools, corner stores, and all that. So people could look at the photographs and get to know the people through their biographies. And finally, the voting took place on March 11th of this year, March 11, 2018. And everyone had a chance to vote for those candidates. And as a result of that, you have the 605 deputies elected to the National Assembly on March 11, 2018. And it was these 605 deputies that met yesterday and today that amongst the deputies elected proposed and elected, for example, Miguel Díaz-Canel as president of the Council of State. Of course, we will say that these are indirect elections. It's true, they are indirect in the sense that people do not vote directly for the president. They vote for the deputies, and the deputies are the ones who select the president from amongst their ranks. Now, there is discussion in Cuba about the need to have more involvement of the Cuban population at the grassroots level in selecting and voting for the president. In fact, a very refreshing event took place several months ago, and that is the new director of Granma, which is the Communist Party of Cuba newspaper, was appointed to be the head of Granma. She's a 35-year-old young women journalist, very new, very active on Facebook and social media with close ties to the grassroots. Now, at the beginning of April, while the process was going on for the elections, she had organized an online sort of a Gallup online exchange between the Granma readers across the country and the people responsible for the elections. And a lot of the questions revolved around the need for more input from the people at the grassroots level in terms of who should be president. And this is one of the main features of this discussion. At the same time, no one was suggesting that we should have a presidential type of system as exists in the United States. But speaking to my colleagues in Cuba, they said basically the same thing. There should be some kind of a consultation take place. Informal or formal consultation, so people at the grassroots level could have their input as to who should be president. So combining this with the way things are being organized now, so these are the type of things that are being discussed in Cuba at this time. And I think the new constitution, the reforms to the constitution, will probably have to take this into account, and will also take into account, for example, the need for a new electoral law.
Mm-hmm. If you can explain, because this is something I read in your book, and I wanted to hope you can tease it out, that there's a connection between Cuba's People's Assemblies in terms of the growth and evolution of them, to the talks that Fidel used to give, where he'd pose a question to the crowd, and the crowd would give about, shout out back responses, and that kind of has some type of connection to the historical evolution of these assemblies and discussion assemblies. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the features of the Cuban political system. You had Fidel Castro is in a class on his own, in a league on his own when it comes to communication. And he sort of trained Cubans to discuss and debate and exchange with the leadership. And this is one of the main features that still exists in Cuba at this time. And I think that the coming months, when the discussion takes place on the reform of the Constitution, this whole characteristic of the Cuban political system of discussing and exchanging with the leadership, perhaps with Miguel Díaz-Canel as a new young leader, that this will come up once again. But at the same time, you mentioned Fidel Castro. No one, there's only one Fidel Castro in terms of communication. You can't have another one. But at the same time, I would say there's millions of Fidel Castros in Cuba, in the sense that young people who want to discuss and exchange. The amount of lively debate that's going on in Cuba at this time is really very impressive, and I think that this is going to develop even further in the coming months.
So are there issues with people attending the assemblies? As I was in some interview, the person said no one's coming to these anymore.
You mean the local?
The local CDR.
It's possible that the attendance has gone down. That's for sure. I mean, I don't have any statistics on it. I don't know if you're referring to the assemblies to nominate people, or if you're referring to the people when they have to render give accountability meetings. It's possible that this has gone down, and there's a reason for it, because the delegates, when delegates are elected to municipal assembly, they work on a voluntary basis. That is, they do their work during the daytime, and then they have to attend to their work as a delegate in the evening or on the weekends. So this is very time-consuming. It's difficult. At the same time, because of the economic limitations, it's difficult for the delegates to solve the problems that the population is complaining about or demanding, changes to be made. So because of that, it's possible that there is a decrease in the participation in these local assemblies. But hopefully, with the new constitution, which will inevitably result in a new electoral law, in my view, that this type of thing will be addressed, and changes will be made in order to try to improve the situation, so the people's attendance, people's participation is real and effective.
Right, and people be inspired to come. Thank you. We didn't even get to the fact that you alluded to the how much people don't get paid, the fact that in the elections and the campaigning, it's not wrought with money and big interest and all those kind of things. Yeah. But it's been a pleasure. We've been speaking with Arnold August. Get this book, Cuba and Its Neighbors, Democracy in Motion. Also, your last book, Cuba, U.S. Relations, Obama and Beyond. Thank you, Arnold. Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.